Hello, I'm Jackie Miller, introducing today's dialogue, Stewarding Our Marine Relations, on behalf of the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science Project. Joining you today from Lekwungen Territory, also known as Victoria, BC, where I'm grateful to live, work, and study. Following a series of dialogues focused on land-based stewardship themes over the last several months, we're happy to finally turn today to marine or ocean-based stewardship, including our stewardship relations with fish and fisheries in today's dialogue. As you'll likely hear more about during the course of the discussion today, this dialogue has been a long time coming in many respects. Our conveners, Kilsley Kaji Sting, Miles Richardson, and Dr. David Suzuki may share how their conversation back in 2016 about how the approach to managing the herring fishery underscored the need for a greater understanding of and respect for Indigenous knowledge within fisheries and marine stewardship, and more broadly in our relationships with the Earth. This conversation today ties back to the origins of our project, and we're really happy to bring it forward today, and happy that our speakers are able to be here with us. Today's dialogue brings together speakers well-versed in their people's stewardship traditions and legal orders, as well as in marine ecology and collaborative planning, to speak to us about the challenges for Indigenous and collaborative marine governance and how Indigenous knowledge and science can come together to create more sustainable ways of stewarding our relations in marine ecosystems, including our relations with each other as peoples coexisting and sharing sustenance and responsibilities in marine ecosystems. Before we turn to today's dialogue, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. The dialogue will run for approximately 2 hours. And after formally opening the session and hearing from our panel, excuse me, the moderator, who I'll introduce in a moment, will turn to our Reconciling Ways of Knowing project conveners, and then to you, our attendees, for your questions. The chat function will be closed during the dialogue, so we ask that you please direct your questions to the speakers through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, where we will look for your questions during the Q&A part of the program. You can post your questions there at any time during the discussion once the panel gets started. We'll address all questions as time allows, and we will also not be using the hands raise function today, so please direct your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're recording the session, so anyone unable to participate in the entirety of the session can view it later online, but we're grateful if you can stay with us for the entirety of the discussion. And now I'm pleased to introduce my colleague from UVic Law, our moderator for today's dialogue, Saul Brown. Saul is Heiltsuk and Nuu-chulnith. He has a political science degree from the University of Victoria and is currently completing his law degree at UVic. As a perpetual student of Heiltsuk governance and law, he sees the intrinsic value and necessity of giving effect to Heiltsuk laws on the water and land from which the Heiltsuk come. He has worked with elders, knowledge keepers, government officials, and community members from different nations on many projects with the intent of breathing life into Indigenous law in contemporary times. Over to you, Saul.
Thank you, Jackie. So good morning, everybody. Before we get started on the panel, we're just going to open this up in a good way. So today we have Gatuas Brown here to share with us a spiritual opening so we could all have the right intentions moving forward. Gatuas is a language speaker who teaches in the Language Nest up in Heiltsuk Territory. She's also done her first year of immersion there and holds a degree from UVic as well. So Gatuas, if you will, please.
Yo, Gatuas Kunugwa Hilsuk Nugwa Akla Taswa Glesla. My name's Gatuas and I live in Waglesla, which is more commonly known as Bella Bella. And I'll just start off by Amatla is to pray, and I'll just ask everybody who's listening, invite you to close your eyes, and Hasid is to breathe in, and Hasud is to breathe out. So again, we'll do that a few times. Hasid, do Hasud, Hasid, do Hasud. Gayasika Ugami, thank you, Creator. Gayasika kan egit nayus, thank you for everything. Gayasika kan lakoklayo. Flo galaxy kan ugonaxi, ambakas egit mas washdam, ambakas egit mas gotni. Gayet nasat na e ambil, gayet nasat na wabach tus gutla. thankful for everything and for the day. We call on our ancestors and our family that has come before us. We ask that everything that happens today happens in a good way and that strength is given to all of these people. Hisquali. If everyone wants to say Hisquali, it means so be it. And it means that we're all in agreement that it will happen. So Hisquali. And I just offer love and light to all of you. You can feel free to open your eyes and that you'll have a good session. You can hear the noises of a glacier. I'm just sitting outside the language nest, so. And Saul asked if since the focus is herring, just to share our herring song. I'm just gonna sing it quietly today because our community is in mourning. So with that recognition that offering it up today in as a prayer song, as the fact that there's a lot of grieving happening in Waglesa right now. We've had consensual, like consistent loss upon loss. So just offering it up for all of those in attendance and for the Watwisach, the land that I'm sitting on. And this song was composed during just before our herring standoff by a group of, well, maybe I'll sing it and then Saul can tell you the history. He has a better story for it, so. Okay, so. Whoa, hey, yeah, hey, hey, yeah, yeah, hey, yeah, hey, hey. Whoa, hey, yeah, hey, hey, yeah. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Wesens Bachwala. What ne, whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, oy, oy, oy. Whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, ya, hey, whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, oy, oy, oy. Wesens Bachwala Hamsa and whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, oy, oy, oy. Whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, ya, hey, whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wesens Bachwala Hamsa and whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, whoa, 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 hey, ya, hey, ya, ya, hey, whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wesens Bachwala Hamsa Gagalis, whoa, hey, ya, hey, ya, whoa, whoa, whoa. And so the words are Waisins Bachwala, come and harvest, come and traditionally harvest, get na hamsa, come and eat, get na hamsa, watne, come and eat herring, get na hamsa, ant, come and eat herring eggs on hemlock boughs, get na hamsa, yagya, come and eat herring eggs on stringy kelp. Get na hamsa gagalis, come and eat herring eggs on flat kelp. So wes and spachola, get na hamsa ant. And so I thought that would tie well into your theme of herring, and Saul can tell you the history of the song and how that came to be. Kayasika kawadaks, and Kla. Thank you for listening to me. We.
Wallace Gayasiha Manuyaks, thank you very much, sister. I think that's a perfect way to open it, not only grounding it in marine stewardship and herring, but also the collaborative nature. So that song was a collaboration between some of our Kwakwakwaak relatives to the south and our elders. And as Gatawa said, it was done. So it's an international collaboration. It was done right before the herring standoff in 2015. And it was developed in the contemporary times, but using ancient language and ancient principles of song composition. And then in 2015, the DFO tried to open the herring commercial fishery, and we, as Hilfta, we said no, we're not going to allow this to happen. And so we took a stand as a community, and we occupied the DFO building in our territory on what's currently known as Denny Island, and our relatives occupied DFO buildings all over the province. And again, collaboration, because our laws, our Gwe laws, our Hilfta laws dictate that we stood up for the herring. And then our brothers and sisters and our relatives from all different nations also answered that call in Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish territory and Newhawk territory. And we stopped that fishery that year. And during that standoff, when Kelly Brown and Marilyn Slett, two of our leaders from Hilfta territory, were literally in the office, our children sang that song day and night, sang it so much it was almost unbearable after the 4 days. But it's I think that's the collaboration that we're here to talk about. And so I just thought it would be a good way to open this. And so Wallace Gayasika, thank you again, Gatawas, for sharing your words and your amachla and your prayer. Gatawas is actually my older sister, so I got to grow up with her, and so I think she has to run back to her language nest, so we'll let you do that, Gatawas.
Winisika, Gayasika.
Winisika. So today we're here to talk about marine stewardship and ocean governance. And the ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface. And so it's pretty massive. And as humans, as a society, we're attracted to the ocean, with nearly 2.4 billion people, or 40% of the world's population, living within 100 kilometers of the coast. Thus, this is an expansive and complex topic. It's also a topic that's very close to my heart. As you heard, standing on the front lines in the name of herring, but also coming from two different maritime communities in the Hilfta or Heltzig and the New Channel. So in effort to bring focus to this expansive topic, we'll be focusing on Pacific herring within the greater context of marine stewardship and ocean governance. Now herring, the Hilfta know it as wane, but our fellow panelists, where they come from, the Haida know it as inung, and the Shimshan tsaka. So specifically for Hilfta, the herring hold great importance culturally. We don't go by the Gregorian calendar, we go by the 13 moons. And as a biological indicator, when the herring moon comes around, it's called Kamsista. And in our stories and in our ways of knowing, when that moon comes, it tips over and the herring literally pour from the cosmos into the ocean. Metaphorically showing that it's a gift gift from the heavens or gift from the cosmos, and a gift that needs to be treasured, but also guarded. We also have deep stories that hold laws and that teach us about marine stewardship from a time when supernatural beings roamed the earth. Herring were of very great importance. And Gui, Raven, wanted to move herring from one area of Celtic territory to another, demonstrating the first known ocean management in those waters. And so he did, time before humans. And what this also showed is creating abundance within a balanced ecosystem. So not just being sustainable, but creating abundance, which is reflected in our potlatch. To give wealth away makes you wealthier. The more you give, the more you have. So herring is, it's integral to what is currently known as the Pacific Northwest. For Indigenous people, it holds great importance culturally, ceremonially, economically, and as a source of sustenance. Ecologically, for a healthy coastal ecosystem, there needs to be a healthy population of herring. And Indigenous societies having an inalienable relationship to their territories and all animate beings within the territory, and this includes herring. So this is often characterized by outsiders as a cultural keystone species, which is well taken. But the relationship between coastal people and herring and the constellation of relationships which herring is part of is much deeper and richer than that. Yet, as a society, we are marching towards climate catastrophe as we battle ocean acidification and ocean pollution, dealing with collapsing fish stocks. So we want to turn to the herring and look at the relationship we have with herring as a means of exploring reconciling ways of knowing, but reconciling ways of being. So today's dialogue is an opportunity to discuss and generate reflection on how the relationship of ways of knowing that have prevailed dominantly in fisheries since colonization and marine resource management has impacted Indigenous peoples and the health of our marine ecosystem, and how this can be changed through efforts of Indigenous people, marine ecologists, and through collaborative planning with the Crown. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our panelists now, some of which are very esteemed. All of which are very esteemed. Sorry, my apologies. All of which are very esteemed. So first we have Nung Jawas. Russ Jones is a hereditary chief of the Haida Nation and previously served as manager of the marine planning for his nation. He has a Master's of Science in Fisheries from the University of Washington and has published papers on a variety of topics on fisheries and marine planning and governance. He led the development of the Haida Gwaii Marine Plan approved by the Haida and BC in 2015, and is a commissioner on the Pacific Salmon Commission, and was a commissioner on the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. Next, we have Dr. Simgayet, or Dr. Teresa Ryan. She is Gitlan Shimshan. She is a research associate and sessional lecturer at the UBC Faculty of Forestry. She is also appointed to the Salmon Commission Joint Chinook Technical Committee for Canada. As a fisheries aquatic ecologist, she is currently investigating the relationship between salmon and healthy forest, the Salmon Forest Project. She's also works with the Mother Tree Project, facilitating Indigenous science at the forefront of future forest management and exploring old growth forests and supporting healthy biodiversity. Her research focuses on this intersection of ancestral knowledge systems and science in complex adaptive systems. And our final panelist is Dr. Anne Solomon. She's a professor of resource and environmental management at SFU and leads SFU's Marine Ecology and Conservation Lab. Her research looks at the relationship between humans and coastal marine ecosystems, including the ecological, socioeconomic drivers of kelp forest ecosystems, ancestral clam gardens, and Pacific herring dynamics. She strives to engage Indigenous leaders, knowledge holders, and Crown government agencies in collaborative research and dialogue to navigate the trade-offs between coastal conservation and resource use. So this panel will have two main aspects. The first part, we're going to be exploring the relationships between ways of knowing and how they shape fisheries and marine ecosystems, and how those marine ecosystems are managed by these differences in ways of knowing. The second part will be solutions or options going forward. If reconciliation is possible, how is it achieved? So on part one, we're going to turn to Dr. Teresa Ryan first. So Dr. Ryan, you've done a lot of work in this area, and could you for us lay out how power and jurisdiction determines whose knowledge system gets to be applied and how they apply them? And perhaps in this light, how do Indigenous knowledge and science get taken up by regulatory authorities like DFO?
Thank you, Saul. I'm happy to be here today. The question you ask is, of course, quite complex, and it goes back a long ways in our contemporary history for this relationship. And as you'd mentioned, the relationships that we know from our Indigenous viewpoint goes back much farther, thousands of years. We didn't necessarily understand what happened at the intersection of colonialism and the Indigenous worldview right away. It wasn't something on this coast that was easily observable for quite a while. And in fact, we had a unique relationship with people from other worlds for about a century in the trading industry of when we were trading furs. So it was unusual to hear that all of a sudden somebody else was claiming the lands that we had known for thousands of years. And the change started to happen just about towards the end of the fur trade period, but the establishment of forts on land was the signal that change was on its way. And it wasn't until the mid-1800s that change really started to transpire and affect with intent to change the Indigenous way of life. And this is important because it leads to the legislation that was enacted in the Fisheries Act in the 1880s. And it was a period of time where there was conflict in Atlantic Canada with fisheries and other countries that was a concern to the Dominion. And so that laid the groundwork for establishing the Fisheries Act, which has evolved to what we know it as now. But it was created without, of course, consultation. And this is something that we deal with in contemporary times, but it was never even a flicker of consideration back in the early colonial period. And what that implicated was that we were left out. We were left out of the regulation of the fisheries. And just as Aboriginal communities on this coast were surprised to hear that the Crown was claiming land, the regulation of fisheries was perhaps even more pronounced because that was a way of life. And it was what sustained people and communities for thousands of years. There is archaeological evidence that our fisheries strategies and technologies existed for 5,000 years. And even though in the last 150 years, Indigenous people have been quite vocal and articulating the challenges, it's still difficult for this colonial enacted government to recognize the authority of the Indigenous institutions of the nations and in the communities. And this is where we have a conflict on who is actually laying out the law across the land. And the way that we've known it before and the way that it has been imposed on us is an area of conflict. And it's a deep severing conflict within our communities as well. It was our feast halls, our longhouses, our big houses, if you will, where we laid out our laws. It was an application and practice of our laws. That is the institution where we breathed our existence through our law. We recited our stories. We explained our origins. We were able to demonstrate how our connections with our landscape across the whole of the landscape was efficient in managing the resources by demonstrating the increased abundances, particularly of our fisheries resources. And there were things that had to be done on a regular and ritual basis in order to make sure that there were fish in the future. It wasn't just a matter of fishing in the current year. It was a matter of understanding what was available in the future. And we made sure through our ritual actions and through our habits that we provided the opportunity for fisheries resources to reproduce in the future. And this is what's missing in the current jurisdiction. The Fisheries Act is created to restrict the harvest of fisheries resources. That was the thumbnail sketch of the intent of the Fisheries Act, was to restrict harvest. And in 1888, an amendment was added that Indigenous people could only fish by a certain method and could not sell our resources. We were removed from the economy at that moment in time and have been in an oppressed state since. And this plays into the jurisdiction question because it determines who is going to make the rules, who is going to implement a law, and the results have been catastrophic for Indigenous communities and for the resources, because now nobody is taking care of the resources in the way that we had obligations to do so and had to demonstrate through our social institutions. There's much more to this. There's many things that I could talk about, Saul. So please let me know if you would like me to address something else in there, or if I was successful.
That was great. You're very successful. Thank you. Very articulate in the way the clashing of legal systems that are informed by knowledge really manifest themselves, and how power, subverts itself, or makes one marginalizes one piece of knowledge in respect to another. Gayasika. So I think we'll go on to Russ Jones. Russ, you've written about the need for reconciliation of ocean issues in what's currently known as Canada. Can you speak to what the problem involves and why there's been such limited progress in achieving reconciliation on marine issues thus far?
Good day, everyone. I'm calling today from Skagilna, Skiddigat, Haida. So what is reconciliation? Nadim Rouhana, a scholar in conflict studies and transitional justice, describes reconciliation as a process. It seeks a genuine, just, and enduring end to a conflict and requires a transformation of the relationship between two societies. As such, it requires a course of intertwined political and social changes and must address politically tangible issues such as distribution of power and historical responsibility. As Teresa described, reconciliation is necessary because Indigenous nations were here occupying their land and ocean territories when English and French colonists arrived and established the country that we today call Canada a short 150 years ago. Just as Indigenous children were forced to go to residential schools, there were injustices related to the taking of ocean territories and resources by colonists and settlers. Margaret Moore, a professor at Queen's University, identifies three major injustices as a result of colonization. These are political domination, loss of territory, and cultural imposition. He recognizes that a full measure of justice to account for impacts of loss of territory is not possible. Practical measures are limited to things like compensation, resource and revenues, transfers, return of public lands, use rights over lands occupied by others, and symbolic apology. True reconciliation potentially requires major changes to the status quo. Ruhana identifies principles of truth, speaking truth, justice, taking historical responsibility, and transformation of the relationships between Canada and Indigenous nations. Reconciliation is different from conflict settlement because conflict settlement typically ignores those core issues. Reconciliation requires a change in mindset from current treaty negotiations. So that's a basic description of the problem. So what is this current status of reconciliation of ocean issues? As part of the Ocean Canada Partnership, I worked with 5 co-authors from across Canada to investigate the status of reconciliation of ocean issues across Canada's Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic geographies. I believe that 2 of my co-authors, Nancy Doubleday from McMaster's University and Megan Bailey from Dalhousie, are on the call today. We looked for examples of reconciliation related to 7 ocean issues, including fisheries and marine mammals, shipping, integrated ocean management, aquaculture, oil and gas, marine protected areas, and species at risk. We did this through a literature review and case studies. We found a few bright spots for reconciliation across Canada. Best practices included support or fostering of Indigenous governance and leadership. As well, there were initiatives that restored resource access and supported Indigenous decision-making. We identified 23 criteria for reconciliation based on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. This includes the need to secure free, prior, and informed consent for developments that affect Indigenous people. So why has progress at reconciliation been so limited? Solutions don't seem that complicated. Restoring Indigenous governance systems, laws, and jurisdiction will address the injustice of political domination. Regaining resource access, reallocation of resources, or compensation will at least partially address the loss of territory. Policies that incorporate Indigenous worldviews, knowledge, and result in an equal standard of living for Indigenous people will address the injustice of cultural imposition. Canada has the constitutional framework and is committed on paper to policy change based on justice and recognition of Indigenous rights. Challenges include the mix of federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions, the diversity of Indigenous populations, and political and structural resistance to power sharing. Barriers include a lack of commitment to meaningful change. Change is often limited to modest or incremental measures that are not transformational. For example, 5 Nuu-chah-nulth nations on the west coast of Canada proved their commercial Aboriginal right to fisheries in 2011 within 9 nautical miles of the headlands. But Canada is still wrangling over what this means in terms of fair Nuu-chah-nulth access and management of salmon, groundfish, and shellfish fisheries. Is it 5%, 50%, or more of adjacent fishery resources? Likewise, access and ownership has an impact on how fisheries are managed. So what does reconciliation of ocean issues require? Based on our review, we outlined a path forward and identified 5 key policy changes that are needed. First, adopting a just and equitable reconciliation framework. Second, engage in Indigenous communities on visioning and planning of ocean spaces to reinforce their connections to place and better incorporate Indigenous traditional knowledge and worldviews. Third, cooperatively pursuing holistic approaches to management, such as integrated and ecosystem-based management. Fourth, supporting and establishing co-governance arrangements that integrate knowledge systems, share power and responsibility, and redefine relationships. Finally, supporting Indigenous self-determination and capacity. Ocean health and community well-being depends on our ability to work together to transform our relationship to one of meaningful power sharing and mutual responsibility based on recognition of Indigenous rights. We can implement reconciliation through the sharing of knowledge and management responsibilities and the implementation of free, prior, and informed consent for development across Canada at all scales of ocean policies. Thanks, Phil.
Gayasika, I really appreciate the methodical approach that you have to solutions aren't that complicated. Now we need to listen to Russ, everybody, because he's got the method to addressing this. So Gayasika, thank you for that. Next, we'll move on to Dr. Ann Solomon. So as a university professor, Ann, what role does science and Indigenous knowledge play, including in relation to each other in institutions like universities? And then how does this role manifest itself in institutions like DFO? And thinking about this, how is proper knowledge, or what even is knowledge, defined in these institutions and then thus manifest themselves in regulatory bodies like DFO?
Gayasika, Saul, that is a great question. And I'll kind of springboard off of some of the points that Teresa and Russ have made so eloquently already. It's my sense that university institutions have a strong social responsibility, a moral responsibility to democratize the scientific endeavor. We need to make it more inclusive. We need to make it more inclusive of a diversity of people, of objectives, and knowledge systems. And one thing that brings me hope, much like your sister's song, is I do see a sea change in the young people coming through the graduate program where I'm teaching. I see a lot of openness. I see a lot of eagerness, open minds and open hearts to different ways of knowing. And these are our future scientists, our future leaders, but we definitely need to diversify who's in that room in a major way, and we need to support that. The legitimacy of different knowledge systems is a huge part of that, and we really need to expand what we consider legitimate sources of knowledge. And my sense that there are really tangible solutions towards this. And the first thing is having dialogue and really collaborative research where scientists are supporting Indigenous-led, locally led initiatives where we work in service to objectives that have been identified by local communities. And you hear the term knowledge co-production. Basically what that means is when we bring together our different forms of understanding the world, the different lenses through which we make observations and ask questions, we're more likely to ask questions that are relevant to local communities and bring in diverse sources of knowledge that paint a bigger picture of the story. A colleague of mine, archaeologist Christine Roberts from the Wewakam Nation, said it beautifully just the other day when we were talking about clam gardens and bringing Indigenous knowledge, archaeologists, geomorphologists, marine ecologists, oceanographers all together, paddling in the same canoe. In this case, it was a small little motorboat exploring Wyatt Bay and Canish Bay on Quadra Island. And together, by bringing these different ideas together and ways of looking at the world and different time horizons and scales of observation, together we painted a better picture, a more whole picture for all of us. And I think scientists such as myself and universities have a really important role and an obligation to facilitate opportunities for that. The other thing is that we are producing the next generation of resource managers that go into agencies. And my observation now is that there are vast improvements in marine conservation and fisheries initiatives that are more inclusive, but yet they still have failed, and they still fail Indigenous people and the health of marine ecosystems, because there are still large blind spots that remain. I think Teresa and Russ perfectly identified some of the key blind spots, and that is this whole notion of making sure that any fisheries and marine initiative recognizes Indigenous rights and social justice as a dual and equally important goals to ecological sustainability. That's fundamental, and that there is nation to nation dialogue, and that there is decision-making authority that lies in the hands of Indigenous people. That has to be there. And the other set of big blind spots that I see right now is that the siloed thinking where there's definitely a focus on single species and biomass, optimizing biomass as kind of the main outcome of many management strategy evaluations and specific targets, really just offer one small piece of a much bigger pie of outcomes that we should be striving to manage for. So we need to diversify the governance outcomes, like Russ described really well, that we're managing for. And we need to expand that time horizon. Most initiatives, fisheries and marine conservation initiatives on our coast, look back maybe several decades when we should be looking back and forwards millennia. So many of these initiatives really don't take into account the millennia of interactions between humans and coastal ecosystems that have been there for thousands of years. And I think if we do, we're more likely to really find some innovative solutions to some of the key problems, Saul, that you brought up, like ocean acidification, ocean warming, and what have you, because local people have been devising very innovative mariculture systems and governance rules, like you and Teresa described really well, that we can learn a lot from.
Jessica, I love that, the bigger picture, seeing the whole issue, right? Understanding that these systems are interconnected, and it's not a siloed or compartmentalization of we're going to manage herring, but we understand that when the herring come to spawn, everyone comes to feast. The whales, the wolves, everything marine and terrestrial. And so I love that we're all in the same canoe. Sometimes it's a motorboat, sometimes it's a canoe. And so I really appreciate that. And I think it's really encouraging to hear that coming out of academia as well, because as you say, you are producing the next generation of resource managers, and hopefully it won't be so siloed or compartmentalized. And so that's awesome to hear and very encouraging. So this next part, as we said, this next set of questions is about solutions or options going forward. And I know for myself, there's some anxiety around climate change and all the things that just let Anne mention about ocean acidification and whatnot. And so I think it's really important, especially for the younger people, to have some hope beyond the foreseeable horizon, to have some hope for future generations. And so when we look at our kids, our nieces, our nephews, our grandkids, our great-grandkids, they can have some hope for them in the natural world. And so I think this next part is really important, not just for going forward for the health of the ecosystem, but for the health of ourselves, our own mental health. We're in the midst of a global pandemic that's been really hard mentally, emotionally on a lot of our Indigenous communities and the whole community, right? And so I think this is a really important part that I'm really happy to talk about. And so maybe we'll go to you first, Russ. And so you've been a leader amongst the Haida and other coastal people in developing the Haida marine planning and in negotiating and implementing collaborative marine planning, including with crown governments, those same crown governments that have oppressed and marginalized our knowledge and subverted our laws. So I have a question in terms of how might marine planning and negotiating with these people who come from outside of our worldview facilitate these different ways of knowing?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Saul. Yeah, I've worked in marine planning since early 2000s. A healthy ocean and abundant marine resources are essential to the well-being of Haida people. Land and marine use policies and plans have been developed solely by the Haida Nation, as well as together with other governments. Marine plans reflect natural resource policies consistent with the Haida Constitution, which states that the nation shall establish land resource policies consistent with nature's ability to produce and that apply to all users of the territories. To the extent that marine plans are negotiated, they represent government-to-government commitments between the Haida Nation and Canada. About 2004, we began to work with the federal and provincial governments and coastal First Nations partners to develop integrated ocean management plan. This work resulted in two plans that I'm going to talk about today. One was the Haida Gwaii Marine Use Plan, which was approved by the Haida Nation and the province of British Columbia in 2015. This is a marine spatial plan and provides a roadmap for management of ocean activities in the Haida Gwaii subregion. The federal government was not a signatory. The other plan is the Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Area, or PNCEMA plan, which was approved by the federal government, the province of British Columbia, the Haida Nation, and 10 other First Nations in 2017. It establishes an ecosystem-based management framework for the region. It also outlines high-level objectives and identifies 5 priority activities, including development of a marine protected area network. The Haida Gwaii Marine Plan incorporates a Haida worldview and Haida marine traditional knowledge. The plan outlines Haida ethics and values that govern our relationship with other living beings. There are 6 principles or laws that relate to a certain extent to scientific principles of ecosystem-based management. These are, first, Yahgudam, meaning respect. This governs our relationship with each other and all living things. It can be translated to the precautionary approach. In interconnectedness, everything depends on everything else. This reflects integrated management. Eat juice, balance. This is reflected in the Haida saying, the world is as sharp as the edge of a knife. It reflects the need for sustainable use. Other Haida principles include responsibility, seeking wise counsel, and reciprocity that are equivalent to an exclusive and participatory approach, adaptive management, and equitable sharing. These values have been adopted by the province of British Columbia, Waihanas partners, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and stakeholders. They have guided our actions as we developed and are implementing marine plans for Haida Gwaii waters. The Haida Gwaii Marine Use Plan was informed by a Haida Marine Traditional Knowledge Study. This work was done over a period of 3 years. It covered every inch of Haida Gwaii, and it was published in 3 reports that are publicly available. The Traditional Knowledge Study informed zoning in the Haida Gwaii Marine Plan. It was also used in review of marine development applications. Haida ethics and values and traditional knowledge are incorporated into decision-making through the governance structure. Marine plan implementation is overseen by a management board that has 2 Haida and 2 provincial representatives. Regional decisions are made by a Marine Plan Partnership Executive Committee that has a Haida representative. Earlier this morning, I mentioned 23 criteria for reconciliation that we identified based on examples of reconciliation in Canada and a review of UNDRIP. The Haida Gwaii Marine Plan meets 7 of those criteria. Those are: 1, development of joint policies and plans; 2, policies and practices to secure Indigenous consent. While the marine planning process didn't meet criteria of free, prior, and informed consent, it did support enhanced consultation and was an improvement. 3rd, incorporation of Indigenous priorities and strategies into decision-making. This occurred to the extent possible for activities within provincial jurisdiction. 4th, Indigenous capacity to govern or manage. Funding was available to each subregion, including Haida Gwaii, for the first 5 years of implementation. 5, incorporation of traditional knowledge into policies and plans. As mentioned, traditional knowledge informed marine plan development and zoning. It was also used in the Northern Abalone Recovery Plan and is being used in the Haida Gwaii Herring Rebuilding Plan. 6, Activities occur consistent with community values. The plan's zoning, the EBM approach, objectives, strategies, and best practices reflect community priorities. And finally, number 7, policy and plans incorporate an Indigenous worldview. The plan prioritizes culture, healthy, intact ecosystems, and sustainable communities. The Pensima plan and process falls short on many of these same criteria. The lack of federal participation in the Haida Gwaii Marine Plan created a number of challenges. The province could only make limited commitments to marine protected areas, fisheries, and shipping management. Since the 2 plans were endorsed, additional processes and agreements have supported collaborative work on those other files using governance structures similar to marine planning. The Haida Gwaii Marine Plan listed several areas of disagreement that were not addressed in the plan. These included future salmon aquaculture and offshore oil and gas development. Oil tankers in Haida Gwaii waters were also listed, but this was later addressed by the federal government through the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. Few other challenges with sharing traditional knowledge and bringing it together with science and decision-making include confidentiality and potential misinterpretation or misuse of information. Thanks, all.
Gaska Hawa, Russ, and I know it's not a perfect world if you met 7 of the 23 criteria, but I think that's still leading for the coast. And I always had much admiration for our Haida relatives. In fact, we have a peace treaty signing, and we exchange gifts. And part of those gifts we exchanged to validate the peace treaty between the Hilftach and the Haida was that herring song that was used to open us. And so I think it's a great connector between the Haida, the Hilftach, and the Shimshan even. So all the panelists on here, we're connected by saltwater. We're the saltwater oceanic people. And so that's awesome to hear. So thank you for sharing that. So next we're gonna go to, speaking of Shimshan, we're gonna go to our Shimshan relative, Dr. Ryan. And you've outlined very beautifully the problems with using science to validate our knowledge. And you told the story of how we lost our management authority and we were stripped of our authority of implementing our own oceanic laws. And you also articulated in a way that, we don't need Western science to regain our authority, although validating it helps, but it's not a needed aspect. So how does history help you articulate a vision for restoring our rightful authority for managing our relations or resources? And what possible relationships do you see between Indigenous knowledge and science in the context of our authority and jurisdiction being eventually respected and implemented?
Very good question. Thank you, Saul. I think it's really important to acknowledge that our ancestors in the early colonial period were very generous with Aboriginal knowledge. I mean, they shared the location of fish resources with people that were arriving, if you will. They, told them about fish and particularly salmon and what kind of fish they were and where to find them and how to fish for them and what the run timing was and the spawning timing. And all of these things were shared quite generously. And so it was a matter of, our knowledge was being used and it later switched once the regulatory mechanisms were in place. Then it became a matter of justifying the use of science from the colonial perspective, the Western science, as a tool in management. Yet it is an imperfect tool because science is still evolving. Science is very dynamic in itself. But it was used as a matter of restricting the stewardship that the Aboriginal people used in managing the resources. And that was important because it took us away from the resource. It's the authority of the power is in the jurisdiction, but Canada doesn't recognize the Indigenous or Aboriginal jurisdiction. And that's what has continuously kept us oppressed. And whenever there is a situation where there is an interaction of conflict, then science is used as the rationale to justify a decision. The Atlantic cod story in Canada is a really good example where it's misused. The scientists were telling Canada that the Atlantic cod fishery was collapsed and that they had to stop fishing, they should stop fishing. But Canada did not heed the scientists' advice and instead fished out the Atlantic cod. And the same thing has been going on this coast with Pacific salmon. We're seeing declines in Pacific salmon, and yet science is being used as the tool to make the decisions. And as I've mentioned, it's an imperfect science. The science that they're using for fisheries resources it's what I call a numbers game. And it's almost a fixation with trying to evaluate the distance of a data point in a graph away from a mean. So when you have a line in a graph and you've got data points around it, the closer you can get those data points to that mean line is an element of precision and accuracy around the data points, but it's still an estimate. And when you're looking at these data points, you're not looking at the fish. You don't see the fish. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, Aboriginal fishers were out there and expressing that we need to go fishing in order to understand what's going on with the fish. And even up until the 90s, I recall hearing our fishers say these things. We need to go fishing so that we can see the fish. And they were literally laughed at by resource management and by other fishing sectors at the time, because the other fishing sectors were competing for their share of the resource. And what was set up was this competing environment of resource users that actually still exists. And that is another way to use that tool of science to justify a rationale for each of these different user groups. And the challenge is that, when we think about our knowledge systems and understanding the connections that we have to these knowledge systems are still intact. They still remain. We still, know that the Okanagan people can tell you about the different face of a Chinook salmon. And what that means is the difference between a fall and a summer timing. Well, these are the things that we still know about the resources, but we are constrained in our ability to use our knowledge. We are constrained in our ability to use our stewardship practices. When we, at our stone tidal traps, when we would use those stone tidal traps, we would allow the largest fish to go through to the spawning grounds. We would make sure of it in the fishing weirs in the rivers. The largest fish, the largest females, were allowed to go to the spawning grounds. It's because they had the most eggs, and the largest males too. And when we would have the largest females and the males mating, then we have larger fish. And for example, in the Chinook world right now, we see coast-wide a decline in the size of Chinook salmon. And they're continuing to decline. It's because nobody's allowing the largest fish to go through. And in fact, there's some of our friends that prefer to have the largest fish. So there has to be some limits in understanding the cycles of these resources. And this is something that we can contribute with our knowledge and our understanding of these cycles. We still have them. We may not be, we may be reluctant to share them because we've unfortunately shared so much, and it has cost. It has cost Aboriginal people many things. And when you think about how we've lost our land, we've lost our cultural practices, or the intent was there to remove them as a part of assimilation. and the children were taken away as a part of that assimilation project as well. And the resources now have been depleted. What's left? You have to ask, why should any knowledge be shared if this system is going to keep taking things and not giving? Because this is a fundamental part of our value systems, that generosity that Ning Jing Was mentioned, that balance, the reciprocity. It's still a fundamental component of who we are, of our identity, and of our connection to these lands and waters. There is no separation between the two in our world. They're connected. And it's restoring these connections that will help us to ensure there is a future for us and for the future children and for the future generations of herring, of ulican, of salmon, of halibut, of clams, of crabs, of trees, of cedar. Without cedar, there's no water. You have no water. If without cedar, we have no habitat for salmon, right? These things are so connected. And if we have the opportunity to engage our knowledge systems again in a way that is authentic to our expectations in using our jurisdiction, then we would have capacity support, not just token change tossed at us through an Aboriginal fishery strategy or an Aboriginal access to resources and oceans management funding envelope or portfolio, if you will. It would be genuine collaboration. When you look at the US tribes in Washington in regards to salmon and Oregon, through two different court actions, one UV Bolt and the other Oregon, you see that the Columbia River tribes working together through the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission established Waikan Ishmiwakishwit. That's the spirit of the salmon. And that laid a foundation for their development of strategies and how they were going to recover salmon in the Columbia River. They're up against immense obstacles. And it is still a pillar in their work, but they are extraordinarily sophisticated when it comes to their capacity and their ability to actually even use science. The Yakima have the Klickitat project on the Cle Elum River where they're raising hatchery fish generated like other hatchery fish, except that they are acclimated in oxbows to the Yakima River. So they have a natural acclimation process, and the success is phenomenal. They're restoring their populations, and we need this so desperately coast-wide right now in our salmon populations. And we should have that ability to get our capacity to a level we need it. There are examples in New Zealand, the Tukuaha, that shows the government acknowledged their obligations to support the people, the Maori people, in building their capacity. And so they've got their PhDs working in an office that is collaborative with the government. And until we have that level of capacity development, we're still just tokens. We're still just showing up for meetings. We're still just getting expenses barely covered and trying to make a contribution to change. I think I've answered your question.
You have indeed. Yes, Kayasika, thank you. And to one of your earlier points, I think about, this imperfect system and science being weaponized, not only in the decision-making, but the justification. And I think of, scientific racism that was used when, newcomers first came and they brought slaves in the Atlantic slave trade. And that was used as a justification in this evolving story, if you will, of science, right? And so I think it's really good to be attuned to that and understand that that's knowledge. It's imperfect, but it's what we have to work with. So thank you so much. And heading into science, after you talk about its weaponization, we're going to move to Dr. Ann Solomon, and you specialize in collaborative research and dialogue, and I've seen it firsthand, and much admiration for whenever you come up to Healthic territory and assist with this. So what are some examples of better stewardship or good stewardship that has resulted from the participation of Indigenous peoples and knowledge in applied marine ecology? And then what are some ongoing problems since science may have been engaging appropriately with Indigenous peoples and knowledge, and what are some opportunities for change? So what are some examples of on the ground or on the ocean? And then where are the opportunities from change from in your approach to science? And we've already heard some from both Russ and Teresa about some opportunities for change.
Yeah, Jessica. So, okay, so I do want to share some visions of solutions, that solution space, and I want you all to picture a picture that I have in my mind. I have a picture of my mind from 2 summers ago, working at the science and culture camps in the Gulf Islands in the restoration of ancestral clam gardens there. And there's this little boy, and in one hand he's got a butter clam, and in another hand he's got a native little neck clam, and his hands are pretty little, so the clams look enormous. But behind him is this beautiful shell hash of barnacle and clam behind him, and behind that a wall that has just been restored. And his ancestors have been tending that place for thousands of years. We know at least in that area 3,000 years according to radiocarbon dates, and highly likely more because we just don't have the dates yet. And to me, this is a picture of the solution space to work towards. On that ancestral clam garden, for those of you who don't know, these are intertidal rock wall terraces built by people throughout the Holocene. The oldest ones date to around 4,000 years. They double clam production. And not only do they at least double clam production and probably more, they do beautiful things by creating very unique environments. And Saul, you said, you know, what are some of the solutions given this future we have of climate change? It is worrying. And to me, this offers hope. It offers hope because all of the learning and the teachings from these clam gardens have showed us that the rich carbonates from all that shell hash I just described, they can buffer seawater from ocean acidification. And because of the way they've been ingeniously engineered, they can buffer extremes in sea temperatures. We've shown that with data, that they make in the summertime, the sediment a little bit cooler to help those clams to deal with things like heat waves. In the winter, they make it a little bit warmer to deal with things like freezes. And to me, these offer such an amazing example of ingenuity from the past that we can definitely use today and into the future to build resilient food systems, not just the production of those clams in the hands of this little boy, but the relationships that he has with his family and his whole community, and with all of the people involved in the restoration of these amazing ancestral clam gardens. And the beautiful thing that I see is more and more nations up and down the coast that want to reinvigorate and breathe life into these practices. And with those practices come all the things, the intangible things you can't see, all of those governance principles that Teresa and Russ and Saul, you have described. To me, that offers huge hope for the future. And I think there are many, many examples of that. That's just one. I do want to reflect and echo some of the things that Teresa said that are so important. Science is not neutral to power. The questions we ask, how we ask them, the data we use is all influenced by the political context around us. And I think that is such an important point to make. And the more we are aware of that, and the more we can realize how we need to open the tent and open our views and be more inclusive and recognize all of the influences that do dictate the kind of questions we ask, the more likely we are to ask better questions, ask more just questions, and do a better job informing some of these amazing examples of work that's being done. By the way, the example I gave is led by Sky Augustine, who just happens to be a doctoral student of mine, and her work with Halkamina and Wasanich working groups and Parks Canada in this case to do this work. It is an amazing example. And there are, like I said, budding examples up and down the coast.
Gayasika, I love that that aspect of, these ancient practices providing solutions to modern problems, right? And we know that the climate's always been changing, but now in the Holocene, it's exacerbated. But so Gaiasica, thank you, Anne, thank you, Teresa, thank you, Russ. We're now at the point in our agenda where we're going to turn to the reconciliation ways of knowing conveners. And these people don't really need an introduction, but their bios are on the webpage if you do want to look them up. And so we have Miles Richardson, Dr. David Suzuki, and Dr. Nancy Turner, and we're hoping that they will share their reflections. Each one has about 8 minutes per convener to comment or pose questions to the panelists. So perhaps we'll start with our Haida relative, Miles. Miles, would you like to have a comment on the conversation thus far?
Saul, I'd just like to commend the panelists for a really enlightening and focused dialogue on one of the core fundamental issues that led to this reconciling ways of knowing dialogue. I know Dr. Suzuki and I were having a conversation about building Indigenous economies and talking about the need for Indigenous people to come to that table as who we are, as the ancient nations, continuing from history, being who we are, carrying out our responsibilities in our homelands, and joining together with Canada and through the Crown governments in solving some of these issues. And one of the most glaring one was the herring conflicts on the coast over the last 15 years that you recounted quite in detail, Saul. But Indigenous people, as Russ has laid out, the Haida Nation, the Heiltsuk, the Tsimshian, and others have been talking to Canada through the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, through the fishing community, about how to do this right, about how to live in a respectful, sustainable way with our relatives in the ocean, and to no avail. And we get into all these conflicts where you see Indigenous people out on the water taking direct action to stop fisheries, and all these negotiations are going on. But what you've done here today, I think, is really useful in framing a dialogue going forward on this. And that's what we wanted out of this process. And your panelists have been brilliant in shining some light, I think, on a path forward. When we talk about reconciliation, when I hear that word, what it means to me is let's just face it, we're all here to stay. Indigenous people being the living generation of ancient nations with all of who we are, our responsibilities and rights intact, our title. Canada, represented by the Crown, are here. Nobody's saying get on your ships and go back home. What the purpose of this reconciliation is figuring out, given that we're all here to stay, is how are we going to share and coexist with respect for each other? And we need to find a way to do that. With respect to this herring dialogue, I think it's really fundamental. When we look across the country, when we look across the globe, we see a similar challenge with caribou. You see a similar challenge with pipelines. You see a similar challenge on a more global level with climate change or biodiversity loss. We got to figure out how to have this dialogue and set up a framework. But that framework is really going to have to, and I think Teresa said this quite eloquently in terms of the frustrations of science. But we need to recognize in framing that dialogue that we still have two solitudes, that the Indigenous worldview and the Crown worldview are separate. That describes it adequately. And we need to figure out a way, if we are going to live together, of how to bring those together in a homogeneous way of living, and a homogeneous, coordinated, harmonized set of laws. But one thing that's really clear is that bringing Indigenous knowledge together with science, there's only one arbiter that's going to get us there. And that arbiter must be the truth. We can't go forward on lies, on ideological assumptions, and all of that mischief that has got us into this mess, these conflicts. We need to strive to understand and agree. I mean, we're humans, we have limited capacity, but we need to try and figure out what's real, what's facts, what's the truth, and have that guide our actions together. And we need to decide what our common values are. You know, if we have a common value of justice or sustainable living in a sustainable way, we're gonna move forward on in this dialogue about figuring out solutions to these ways of living. We're going to understand that really any of our rights, whether they're in Indigenous nation, Haida, Celtic, Tsimshian, or Crown, they begin with responsibility. You know, that's what our people have understood, have based our cultures on. They begin with responsibility and title, and from that comes the rights that we're all seeking to establish and protect. Anyway, I really look forward, and I think we've set the basis for a productive dialogue going forward. And who knows? You know, I heard this morning there's a new West Coast Fisheries Minister in Ottawa. Maybe they'll join all of you with this brilliant analysis, with shining the light on going forward, and maybe we could create a new day with a dialogue. You know, Russ, you've been banging your head against this wall for 30 years, and you guys are giving me hope this morning. I don't want to go on, and good job.
Gayasika, thank you, Miles. And I think you nailed it on the head with common values. And even when we think about Indigenous economies, you know, we built our economies off sustainability, right? We're not going in there and, you know, doing kill fisheries, we're doing sustainable fisheries. And then that common value, illuminating a path forward, but to invoke what Russ said earlier, not in a way that's like conflict resolution, but in a way that addresses the structural impediments to power and jurisdiction sharing. And so I thought that was a great way of kind of framing how we can come together and as you say, continue to have this dialogue. So Gayasika, next we'll go on to Dr. Nancy Turner to have some questions, comments, or just to share their thoughts on today's conversation thus far.
Thanks so much, Saul, and good morning to all of you. It's been a pretty amazing series of presentations, and thank you so much. I want to acknowledge that I'm here on the territory of the Snuneymuxw Nation here on Nanaimo on Protection Island, and our house happens to be situated along the coast here in a place that I've been told was a traditional area for harvesting herring spawn by the Snuneymuxw and other related nations in this area. And only once in the 10 plus years that we've had this house have I ever witnessed a herring spawning on our beach here. And that was an amazing event in 2013. And at night, all night long, the herring boats were out right in front of our house with their lights on, catching those herring. And it made me think of the difference in the way the Heiltsuk and other coastal peoples have utilized herring. I know they also catch the whole fish, but one of the main and most precious products from the herring is the roe, the eggs. And that is harvested in a sustainable way by the herring spawning on the kelp fronds, or people bringing boughs of hemlock or cedar down and anchoring them in the water for the herring to spawn on. And the herring, as I understand it, the female herring can spawn from age about 6 to age about 13. And so if you harvest the eggs, the herring will continue to live and produce spawn for all that time. And it seems such a contrast to me to the commercial herring fishery, where the herring are caught and killed, the 6-year-old female herring and all the other herring, and the eggs are extracted from the dead fish and then sent off as a high quality product to other parts of the world. To me, this represents a whole lot of different things about what's wrong with what we're doing today, and how we're not actually appreciating and understanding the richness of Indigenous practices and knowledge, and all tied in with the values, what is valued in the world, the belief system, the relationships that First Nations Indigenous peoples have developed with all of the different species and with their landscapes around, the way that children are educated from the time they're babies on, and the long-term view that Indigenous knowledge systems embrace, the multiple generations, not the 4-year election time frame that we seem to be operating in a lot today in our political systems and our ways of making decisions. Those things have just come to mind as I was listening to each of you provide incredible and rich accounts from your own background and experience. And in my view, all of you should be now invited to, requested to serve on an advisory board for the new fisheries minister. And I think we could make some real progress there with what the richness of what each of you brings to the table here. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for all that you've shared with us, and the deep thinking and the heart that you've brought with it to what you've provided for us today. Thank you very much. Haichka.
Kayasika, Nancy, and just thinking about the beauty of the herring spawn and all it brings and all it means for my people in particular, but also the values and, as you say, the stark contrast between traditional fisheries where you let a herring come and spawn, and even the way the fisheries practice, like you said, their lights were on all night, they're throwing seal bombs at sea lions, where I was taught by my uncles and my father and my grandfathers, you got to be quiet. You approach slowly where you go into the herring spawn. And so even the way the fishery is carried out, not just that these people are practicing a kill fishery where we're practicing, a fishery where a herring can spawn 6 to 10 times in their lifetime. And we just take what we need. And I think what I often tell people about values when they ask me about, this kind of question, and in particular young people, I say, go down to the beach, go out into the forest, because you can't value what you don't know. Get off your game, go splash your face with some water. And I think that's a big part of it is, ensuring that our people get to know the natural world around them. And so I love that aspect about values. Kayasika, Nancy. And next we're going to go on to Dr. David Suzuki for a comment on the dialogue thus far.
Thank you. I can't tell you how thrilled I have been with this panel today. it exemplifies everything I think Miles and I had in mind when we thought of the idea of having this series of talks. And thank you, well, you, Saul, but the panelists there for this absolutely fantastic presentation today. I think what we're dealing with now is coming to grips with the fact that science and traditional knowledge are fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. Science began really as a way of satisfying our curiosity. For many years, scientists wanted to see how God does his work. And we could use science to peel back the layers of the onion to reveal different aspects of God's handiwork. And I remember even when I graduated from an undergraduate school and said, I want to go into genetics. And people would say, oh, are you going into medical genetics or human genetics? I said, no. I'm interested in basic genetics. I'm not interested in that applied stuff. We look down our nose at the application. We were just trying to find how the hell does all this work? But now we see science as being utilized in a way that it cannot do, and that is to provide the guidance in the way that we're extracting resources throughout this country. Science can't do that because fundamentally what science's strength is drilling down and describing a part of nature. That's the reductionist approach, is to focus and try to separate and isolate. And that is fundamentally different. I want to show you where, Anne is caught up now, I think, in that transition where she's recognizing and acknowledging there's a huge role for traditional knowledge in the kind of science that she's doing. But I just want to remind you of how powerful the reductionist approach has been. We used to think if you took an animal like a chimpanzee, stick it into a cage, feed it, give it water, and care for it, that zoologists then could study those animals and know everything there was to know about a chimpanzee. And when Jane Goodall said, no, I'm going to go into the field, that was regarded as one of the dumbest things you can imagine, to go into an uncontrolled situation. And then what she discovered was when you look at them in the natural world, oh my God, they're a totally different animal. They are social. They cooperate. They use tools. They fight. They wage war with each other, and they kill each other. This you couldn't tell in the way that science normally focuses. And then she did something that was the heart of her criticism. They said, she gave them names rather than call them by a number. She got involved. She cared about those. I got involved in genetics, but all my life I loved insects. And so I was fortunate that I chose to look at insects, an insect, a fruit fly. And every time I look at a fruit fly under the microscope and see their eyes, I wonder how many of you know the color of a fruit fly's eyes. It's a brilliant scarlet color. People are always shocked to see that. Then when you look at the rows of the facets in the eyes, and everywhere the eyes touch, the facets touch, you get a little hair, a bristle, all in a, I mean, it's incredible. But if I were to write a scientific paper and say, the enchanting color, the scarlet brilliance of the eye, and the intriguing regularity of the ommatidia, that paper would be rejected outright, because you can't show that kind of emotional involvement with what you're studying. You have to be objective. You have to look at it from a distance. But when you do that, you don't care. It's just a scientific study that's going on. And so that's fundamentally one of the weaknesses or the failures of the scientific endeavor is to in focusing, you lose sight of the thing or the phenomenon you're studying, and you don't really care for it. The other example I want to give is DDT. When Paul Mueller discovered that DDT kills insects, my God, we thought, wow, that's great, you know, and he did experiments in Florence flasks and in growth chambers and then in open fields, and found it's great for controlling pests. He won a Nobel Prize in 1948. We thought we're going to control, but you know, any ecologist should have said insects are the most abundant, diverse, important groups of animals on the planet. If humans disappear, nature will rebound. If all insects disappear, terrestrial ecosystems will collapse. And yet we chose DDT. Wow, what this really is powerful. Kill all insects to get at the one or two insect species that are pests to human beings. That's like saying, we've got a problem of crime in this neighborhood, kill everybody in the neighborhood. That's a way of getting rid of crime. Sounds pretty stupid to me, but we reveled in the discovery of pesticides. And then years later, people began to say, what the hell's happening to the eagles? They're disappearing. And we discovered a phenomenon that science didn't even know about, called biomagnification, concentration up the food chain. But science could not anticipate that, you know, it rains, it snows, the wind blows, and you end up biomagnifying this molecule up the food chain until you concentrate it tens of thousands of times in the shell glands of birds and in the breasts of women. So science cannot provide the context because it focuses. And there is so much out there in nature, we can't possibly manage what we don't know about. I was electrified when Teresa talked about the laws, the Indigenous laws, that the important thing is the health of the fish, you know, and in my you know, long history with environmentalism, I see that the fundamental crisis we face is that we have gone from the indigenous way of seeing the world, which is an ecocentric way. The ecocentric way of seeing the world understands that humans are a part of a complex web of relationships with all other species of animals and plants, with air, water, soil, and sunlight. That's an ecocentric way, and that we are ultimately dependent on the productivity of that web of relationships for our health and our well-being. And so everything that we do to guide human behavior is based on the understanding that we have a responsibility towards that web, because our very self-interest is tied up in that web of relationships. And so the goal of the laws that Teresa was talking about is to ensure that those fish will continue to flourish. A radically different way of the modern, the colonial way of seeing it is, those are all resources. We're at the top of the chain, and everything is about us. It's around us. You know, so our legal systems that guide us are all based on defining our rights and property boundaries. That's our legal system. But what about the right of a bird to live its life as it evolved to do? What about the right of a community that is a forest to flourish, or the right of a river to flow as it has for millennia? I mean, who the hell do we think we are? We're going to give rights to everything? And we're so ignorant, we don't even know about how those systems are working and flourishing. But that anthropocentrism, the idea that we're at the center and everything is about us, is built into our legal system. It's built into our political system. It's built into our economic system big time. And that's what the change that's happened. So You know, we talk, Russ, I know you're negotiating and working with all of the government trying to work out a place for Indigenous people. I say, give it all back and let us then regulate whatever through the kind of traditional ways that those areas have flourished for millennia. The colonial system doesn't work. And we're in a deep crisis. I'm thinking of the political system now. We're all excited because Stephen Guilbeault is the new environment minister. And Stephen Guilbeault was an environmental activist. He was a Greenpeace member. He founded Equiterre. I was at Kyoto in 1997, and there was Stephen there supporting us in what we're doing. But I also remember 1988, when Brian Mulroney was reelected and as environmentalism was at its height, and to show how he cared about the environment, he chose his brightest political star to be the environment minister, Lucien Bouchard. I interviewed Lucien Bouchard 3 months after he was appointed. I said, what do you think is the most important issue that Canadians confront? This is 1988. And he immediately said, global warming. Oh, that was impressive. So I said, how serious is it? And these are his exact words. It threatens the survival of our species. We have to act now. Wow, 1988. You know, at that time, a group that had met in Toronto said, we've got to reduce emissions by 20% below 1990 levels in 15 years. If we had done it, Lucien Bouchard said, it threatens the survival of our species. And then what happened? He ultimately resigned to go and lead separatism in Quebec. So I guess that's more important, separate Quebec than the survival of our species. So Stephen Guilbeault is in there, that's great. But he's in a political system. Let's see what he can do. We need to transform ourselves from that anthropocentric way of seeing the world into an ecocentric way, and that changes everything. Sorry, I've gone on too long, but I've been really excited by today's panel, so thank you very much.
Gaska. Thank you, David. And I think about this in context of your fruit flies and you know, the human-centered, anthropocentric way of doing law, and how law, in contrast, the common law is built on jurisprudence, which is the past, like looking back at past cases and you know, objective and no beauty in it. I think this could be applied to governance too, whereas like Indigenous law, you know, loves beauty and puts paramountcy on aesthetics. And this can be seen through our stories, our songs, our ceremonies, artistic renderings, massive totems that are behind Teresa for her background right now in her languages, the song my sister shared. And so that's introduced to future Celtic generations. And our laws are forward looking, in contrast to common law that's built on jurisprudence that's looking back. And it can seem like our law might be imaginative or even fantastical. Giving rights to non-human things might seem fantastical to the outside world, but really it's not. And so it's showed that, you know, the Celtic legal order and the beauty that's invested in this justice, or to continuation of fish, as Teresa put it, is essential. And that's to me, the functional aspects of being future looking and future orientated, and functional aspects of beauty as well in the legal order. And so I really appreciate that. Thank you, David. And so now
we're gonna... Saul, if I could just say, I'm sorry that Dave Corshane isn't here with us today, because Dave has really strongly emphasized the importance of ceremony. And I was thrilled to hear your sister sing that song. I even recognize Aunt as Herring Row. I know in Simshan, I think it's Swint, or isn't it Swint? And it's Gao in Haida Gwaii. And I think that ceremony is a reminder of a lot of things. And again, as Teresa said, it's the responsibility. That was the thing that's not present in the systems, the colonial mentality. There's no sense of responsibility towards it. And I think ceremony is a constant reminder of that. Sorry, Ryan.
No, I completely agree. And I think gratitude, right? So that ceremony, giving thanks for the day, being here, it reminds us that that we're human and we're small in relation to the greater ecosystem, but also in relation to the greater universe, right? But we have this vital role to play, so that ceremony being a reminder and being a reminder to be grateful, because we're all part of this interconnected web of the world that we come from, right? And so that's how I see ceremony. And so, yeah, just Gayasika, thank you, David. And we're going to move on to some questions from our people who have posed questions from the audience.
Saul, it's Miles. Let me just say this. Keep telling that story you started about the magic of early spring when the herring return, and the way you started describing it, about all the relationship that stimulates in our world. And join that with what David just said about the reminding us of the importance of beginning with proper ceremony. Everyone needs that. And you know, any proper ceremony begins with acknowledging the magic of that life at that moment you're describing.
Yeah, Gayasika, thank you for that encouragement, Miles. Always good to chat, and I always remember that time sitting on my parents' porch in Bella Bella, and you were giving me teachings on how you brought your constitution home for the Haida Nation. And that's a memory I'm going to cherish for the rest of my life with those teachings. So Gayasika, I always appreciate your words. So next we're going to go on to some questions. This question is coming from the audience, and it's: as universities move to capitalize on Indigenous knowledge, how do we keep Indigenous people as their own authority of their own knowledge? So when Indigenous peoples utilize, and I think the capitalization is where the problematics come in, but so when this gets capitalized on, and perhaps Dr. Teresa Ryan, we'll go to you for this one as an expert on this question.
Okay, thank you. I think that we already have the authority of our knowledge. And it's clearly our laws that we live by give us that authority of our knowledge and the obligation to protect it, which is one of the challenges that we have in reconciliation. We want to protect our knowledge from being exploited. We don't want our knowledge systems to be exploited. And you know, there's a couple of instruments, international instruments, that came to mind that have attempted to try and protect Indigenous knowledge systems. You know, and also you might notice I go back and forth between Aboriginal or Indigenous. The etymology or the origin and meaning of Indigenous actually means poor and suffering, which in our languages, we would never refer to ourselves as poor and suffering, even though we are oppressed and marginalized, as we're talking about here today. But the term Aboriginal is, the etymology is from within, which in my view is more, resonates more closely with our worldviews. So I prefer Aboriginal, but we tend to use Indigenous much more frequently since UNDRIP has come into our world. So the United Nations Declaration or Convention on Biodiversity, Article 8J, was one of those international instruments that attempted to protect Indigenous knowledge systems. And it was a result of the exploitation by the pharmaceutical industry largely, and particularly from the Amazon. And since that time, and about during that time, pharmaceutical companies learned how to artificially synthesize many of the chemicals used for their products. But it's unfortunately, it's still a problem in our Indigenous knowledge or Aboriginal knowledge systems being exploited. Most recent instrument, international instrument, was UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and acknowledging our knowledge systems. But the conflict is when we are not allowed to apply those knowledge systems. And if we can't apply those knowledge systems in a manner that's consistent with our expectations of applying it in providing benefits for our use of our knowledge, then we're hesitant, and rightfully so. As I've mentioned, other things have been taken. So I think that we have The authority, it's the matter of having the authority to apply it. That's where we are constrained. And we need to have some other issues resolved in order for us to be able to express our knowledge in a way that is applying it.
Gayaska, thank you. So we want to try to get to all the questions, and I think we have about, so about 15 more minutes. But so just for the panelists answering these questions. So maybe this one will be to you, Russ, and it's, how can you trust the federal government with an integrated collaborative governance when they can unilaterally restructure that relationship at any time? And sometimes we see this in the turnover and political will from different federal parties and whatnot. But I think the fundamental question here is trust that's needed in reconciling and negotiating with Crown governments.
I guess what I've found is that, if you can write down what your understandings are clearly, right, in agreements or plans, and then you get political commitments to do that, then you're in a much stronger place than if you're relying on verbal promises or commitments, because it does force you to be explicit, right? And also you find out where you don't have some common understanding of something, and then you can see if you can work it out. So it is kind of sometimes kind of a difficult thing to do, but it's important, because that's what leads to kind of lasting solutions or lasting agreements. And I just give the example of, like, with the Guayhanas, where there was initially a Guayhanas agreement and it took years to come with that, to reach that Guayhanas agreement, and then it took more than a decade to come up with a Guayhanas Marine Agreement and how you're going to deal with the marine area. And then those laid the foundation, right, for a Guayhanas management plan, right, which again lays out how we're going to work together on fisheries, including developing a rebuilding plan, for Haida Gwaii herring. And again, with that Haida Gwaii rebuilding plan, we spent several months working on a scope for the plan. We agreed that it would cover herring throughout Haida Gwaii, even though DFO wanted just to focus on the Guayhanas portion, right? We agreed DFO agreed to close the fishery, and we wouldn't talk about opening the fishery until we developed the rebuilding plan. But it took over a year for them to actually come back and say, okay, we agree now, that we won't open the fishery while we're developing a rebuilding plan. So that's the importance of sometimes writing down those commitments and finding out where you agree, but also where you don't agree. Thanks.
No, Gayaska, thank you for that. I know you've dedicated significant time to that Haida Gwaii rebuilding plan, and I'm sure it's informed with those same values and ethics that the other Haida agreements are infused with. So that's awesome to hear. And so we have time for one last question, and this one will be to you, Dr. Ann Solomon, and it's, how can Indigenous systems help address the compartmentalization we talked about today? So we talked about those silos and seeing the bigger picture. And then this one is sort of specific, so you can answer it however you want, but why isn't there more focus on IPCAs as a way to consider marine and terrestrial places at the same time and not separately? So IPCAs, Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's see. I'll start off with the first one that's going to echo some of the comments that David and Miles brought up. When I was taught as a marine ecologist about nearshore ecosystems, I was always taught to imagine the main interactors in a food web, and never in those images that are depicted in textbooks, in lectures, were there images of people. Because people were always viewed as external disruptors to this otherwise pristine ecosystem. And never did those arrows kind of flow both ways. So that the key element and principle of reciprocity was never depicted in this, my teachings as a marine ecologist of human interactions with coastal ecosystems. So I think the earlier discussion on the shift we need in our fundamental worldviews and how we teach sustainability and equity and justice together, and looking at people as components of nature, not as disruptors of nature, I think is a huge way in which we can infuse what we teach at universities in Western science and bring in sovereign, unique knowledge systems, Indigenous or Aboriginal knowledge systems, as Teresa mentioned. And I'll just kind of reflect there too, that I think we can do it respectfully if we recognize that these are sovereign knowledge systems and we're weaving them together. And that's a beautiful metaphor that I know Robin Kimmerer, who's been on these panels, has also beautifully described in her teachings. So that is kind of one way we can bring these knowledge systems together and infuse them in our teachings. Now, the second question on Indigenous protected areas. Yeah, why not? Why aren't we doing that more? And I think we ought to be doing that more. I've certainly recently been learning a lot from New Channel Elder and knowledge holder Jill Martin on all of the work that they've been doing in New Channel territory in that regards. And I think there's huge opportunity up and down the coast to do that. And where we can assist with some of the scientific tools we can bring in, great. But I think doing so where it's needed and how it's needed with the right people at the table is incredibly important. With science working in service to and creating spaces for multiple knowledge systems to inform those kinds of wonderful initiatives, those Indigenous protected area initiatives.
Gayasika. So that brings us to our time for Q&A from the audience, and on the agenda it has a spiritual close. My sister Gatuas, my Manuyaks, isn't here, but just in that ethic and in the ethic of talking about reminders that Dr. David Suzuki mentioned, I think it's just good to have a moment of gratitude. I have so much gratitude for the panelists, Russ, Teresa, and to learn, to be in dialogue is especially someone who's often in the world of Western law. It's been refreshing, and it's not only been refreshing, but it's been hopeful in a good way. And then to also hear from the reconciliation conveners, Dr. David Suzuki, Dr. Nancy Turner, and Miles Richardson. To me, seeing these issues and witnessing the collapse of herring in our territory, where there's a moratorium for multiple years. And then that song came about that my sister shared. And it was only possible through collaborative initiative with other nations. And that song, we sung it when we stood off with Crown governments on the water and then negotiated basically a collaborative management plan for herring that's still in effect today, joint management plan on herring for Heltzik herring. But to me, the herring came back in great numbers. So after we closed down the commercial fishery, the herring came back in great abundance that we hadn't seen in years, that I've never seen that big. My grandfather told me, it's actually not that big to scale when you look back in time for his time. But to me, that speaks to when we stand up for the herring will respond. When we stand up for the salmon, the microplankton, when we live up to our responsibilities and obligations as stewards and governors of the ocean, and in relationship to the ocean, not relationship over the ocean. I think that's it's a good reminder. And so with that, I just want to say Wallace Gayasika, thank you all very much. Thank you to everyone listening, all the participants, for your insightful and great questions, and to the Reconciliation Ways of Knowing staff behind the scenes that make all this work. So I just have nothing but gratitude in my heart, a better understanding of the issues, and some hope going forward, not only for my time here on this planet, but for the future generations' time on this planet as well. So Wallace Gayasika, thank you very much. Now I'm gonna turn it over to Jackie Miller, who's gonna provide some housekeeping remarks for Reconciliation Ways of Knowing. Way.
Hi, Sapka, Hawa, Yatsika, and thank you, Saul, and to all of our speakers, conveners, and attendees for sharing your time with us and your reflections with us today. We'll be sending out a short survey after the session. I've just posted it in the chat as well, and we really appreciate it if all of our attendees today could take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us. We do read that and take all of your feedback into account as we develop our future dialogues. And so yes, we appreciate that time and the time you've spent with us today. We're planning a few more dialogues over the next few months and look forward to sharing more information about those soon. The next session we're planning and hope to be able to announce very soon more formally will be on decolonizing science education and practicing Indigenous science. And we look forward to sharing more with you about that soon. And we're also in the process of turning the dialogues that we've produced to date and the future ones into transcripts, which we hope ultimately to be able to put on our website. We've got recordings of all of our past dialogues on our website. Basically, we want to share all of these conversations as widely and as in diverse forms as possible to enable as many people to join the conversation in the different ways that they can. And we're hoping from those transcripts also to carry the legacy of these conversations forward in the form of a book as well. And we're just working out some of the final details on that before we move forward. So hopefully are able to confirm that really soon. And on that, just wanted to note that we have been keeping a record of all of the questions, and we weren't able to get to all of the questions today that came up. We got to a few of them, but we've got a note of all the other ones, and we hope to be able to address them either through the course of the next couple dialogues that we do, or also in the course of the book, which we will let everyone know about once we know more about that. And so we also encourage you to visit our website, waysofknowingforum.ca, to be sure that you're signed up for updates, and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And last but not least, please donate to support our ability to bring you these dialogues. And you can do so at waysofknowingforum.ca. Thank you very much for your time today.